You may turn to the book of Esther, and I'm going to take a look at the first chapter today. And I want to remind you of something. Esther is the book that they use for Purim. Purim is extremely important because if there were no Purim, there would be no Christmas. And if there were no Christmas, there would be no Holy Week. So it is extremely important that we understand it. And Esther, I think, is a book that is really important for all of us because in this day and age, the book of Esther tells what can God do with one woman of virtue. What can God do with one woman of honor? God can take one individual and use them to change other people's lives and literally to change the whole world.
Yes.
What can God do with one woman of virtue? You know, the culture in our society really is getting more and more grabby. The culture is getting more and more pushy. It is forcing you into a mold. It is forcing you to do things. It is forcing you to compromise all of those values that you have studied and learned and been given by God over the years. All of these things, and the culture is battling them. And the book asks, what can one woman of virtue do in being the servant of God? What can she do? We're in a culture now where I was raised in a way that I always trusted the World Health Organization. I was born in the 1940s, and I always trusted the Center for Disease Control. I was trusted basically many politicians and much government control, and I just always felt that it was okay. I felt that when an executive made an executive decision that I could trust that and I could go along with it. And suddenly I'm seeing a point at which the culture of our world is suddenly going against what God had and wants for his people. You know, that is the point at which we are. We look at the world and we see where we have been in the past 2, 3, 4 years. And suddenly the book of Esther is making a lot more sense to me than it ever made before. It is a lot clearer in viewing what's going on in my world than ever before. It explains the economy. It explains what is taking place. How does God use a woman with honor? How does God use a woman with virtue? How does God use a woman with morals and respect to touch an entire generation, an entire nation? We're going to take a look at 2 women. The first woman is named Vashti. By all earthly standards, she was a loser. But I will tell you, she was a woman of honor. She was a woman who had virtue. She knew who she was. She knew what she was worth. She knew what she had been raised to believe in herself. And then we have a young girl named Esther. Esther comes from our word astral, which means star. And she's the star of the book. And she's the winner. But I want to point out to you, each of these was a woman of honor. Each of these was a woman that God could use for his purpose to shape a world that gave us the Messiah. I love the way it starts in 1:1. And it came to pass. I always love it when it says in the Bible it comes to pass, because that means God is in charge. He's working behind the scenes. He's fit all these things together to make it happen. And it's going to come into being, and he's making it come into being. And it came to pass that Ahasuerus, the king of Medo-Persia. Now this is suddenly extremely relevant. Because what is one of the biggest problems in the Middle East today? It is a country called Persia. These people have a culture that carries them back thousands of years, and they look at us like upstarts.
Yeah.
They look at us, and they believe in their own culture. And what happened to them was, Abraham didn't trust God's promise. Sarah didn't trust God to use her withered body. So she came up with a better idea. And suddenly, the Arabs have their own religion, a religion of war and fighting. And you take that tradition and you add it to the Medo-Persian people, because Medo-Persian means Middle Persian. There were the Iranian people, and then there were the Medo-Persians, and then there were the Babylonian people. And when these all got together, they wound up capturing the world. And Ahasuerus had 129 provinces that he ruled. He went from India all the way across the Middle East, all the way over to Egypt, all the way into Africa. And he controlled all of that land. That was one powerful dude. Mm-hmm. I mean, he had what everybody has been trying to have ever since then. 127 provinces. And from his palace in Shushan, he came up with a really good idea. He said, what I'm going to do, I'm going to throw a party, and I'm going to invite everybody who's anybody to come to this party. It's going to be a blast. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a shindig. I want to tell you. And so he set up colorful, beautiful tents. He set up marble columns with all kinds of ribbons draped from one to another. He set up all this beautiful, beautiful area. He brought all these people. Every prince from the 127 provinces came there. It's sort of like when the people who wanted to control the world said, what we really need to do, and they were guided by a man named William Fulbright, and he said, what we really need to do is start bringing all the young, brilliant men from around the world, all the young, brilliant men, we need to bring them, we need to send them to our schools, we need to educate them and get them highly trained, and then once a year we need to bring them together and we need to give them the vision that we have for world domination. And they developed the Fulbright Scholarship so that people could come and they could learn, and brilliant young men like Bill Clinton could get his law degree, could go to Oxford, could go here, could go there, and he could be indoctrinated into a ruling class to rule the world. That's no new idea. And the technique for doing it is no new technique. And so Ahasuerus said he was going to do it. And he had this 104-day party, because when you're coming all the way from Ethiopia, when you're coming all the way from India, you've got to come. So he came, and they had their tents, and they had everything fixed up, and it was absolutely beautiful. They had gold glasses. Now, I have studied how the technology of the Middle East used to work. And they wanted everything to be perfectly the same. All the lamps are the same. All the cups are the same. And you go to where they had the shops, where they had the factories, where the people worked, and you find that if there's one little flaw, one little difference, one little flared piece of this, that, or the other, they'd smash it. because they wanted everyone exactly the same. Well, this king says that's not the way it's going to be for us. I'm going to make sure that everybody who comes gets a golden goblet that is entirely his own, totally different than anybody else's. And he took and he created in such a way that everybody had a unique one. He had all this creativity put into this. Nothing was the same. Nothing was common. Nothing was there. The gold cups. And the people came, and he had laws. He said, if you want to drink, you can drink. If you don't drink, you can't. You don't have to drink. He recognized the national differences. He recognized the cultural differences. He said, if you want to drink, we'll provide it. If you don't want to drink, you don't have to. But you still get a golden goblet. And so, in the middle of this, he had a 10-day binge. I call it a binge. He didn't call it a binge. He called it a feast. But I know a binge when I hear one. And he invited everybody, all they could eat, all they could drink, all they could do. All these men had come together, all of these men who were going to rule, all these men who were going to control the world, and they all came together, and for 7 days they ate and they drank and they partied and they planned and they just absolutely everything went wonderfully. And then he comes up with the idea, I've got the most beautiful woman in the world. Why don't I bring her out and share her with all these men? And they will see what a beautiful woman I've got. Well, I tend to believe that Vashti, his queen, I believe he married a king's daughter. I believe he married a princess. I believe he married somebody who knew what life was all about. And when he told Vashti, I want you to put on your slinkiest, sexiest, sharpest, shortest, skinniest dress, and come walking out there, she said, they're not going to be looking at beauty. I'll tell you what they're thinking. And you're going to have every one of these men going back to their country thinking about me and what they could have done. It's not the kind of person I am. How do you stand up to the most powerful man in the world and say no? How do you stand up to the most powerful culture in the world and say no? See, I tend to think some of us may get a picture of how that's done because I think the culture of the world is coming together and the electronic media is expanding it and exposing it. I tend to think that the world in which we live, the thoughts which we have, Vashti was there and she understood what these people were going to be thinking, and she said, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. And I believe that she was a princess, she was a queen, she was a powerful woman because he didn't kill her.
No, he didn't.
He banished her. And that was good. He talked to his lawyers, and lawyers always come up with good ideas. He went to his lawyers and he said, what do I do? And they said, well, you've got to banish her, you've got to get rid of her, because she's going to set all the women in rebellion against their husbands. I mean, can you imagine that, Rabila? She thought there would be rebellion. So they said, you've got to banish her, she's got to be gone. So he did. And then he discovered something. He was missing a princess. He was missing a queen. He was lonely. And so what he did at that point, he had sort of like a beauty contest. I say sort of like because they kidnapped every beautiful girl from everywhere in the world that they could find her. They took, and all of these girls they brought together. Let there be a law of the Medes and the Persian that this woman is banished. Do you know how hard it is to stand up? I mean, most of us, It's really very difficult when your boss says to you, I'm going to fire you if you don't do what I say. And you say, yeah, but what you're asking me to do is illegal. What you're asking me to do is wrong. What you're asking me to do is not what should be done. And so she had to give her place up because of that. And I think there may come a time when we as followers of Christ, followers of Yeshua, true people who know the real God, that we are going to be somewhat like this woman. And you know where the strength comes from? It comes from the virtue. It comes from the honor. It comes from the morality that God builds into your life by following Him every day as you move through life. The reason life is not easy is because God is strengthening you. The reason life is not simple is because God is making you sharp. He's making you smart. He's making you intelligent on what you need to do. He is preparing you for what will take place. He's preparing you for what you need to be. And so God, knowing what's coming, He prepares us for these things. And as long as I hold the nail-pierced hand, I really don't have to worry about a lot, because He will take care of me. And that is His promise. And so they went and they gathered all the beautiful women of the world. Can you imagine the size of that spa? I mean, those of you ladies who get your pedicures and your manicures, they would take these women and for the first 6 months, they would soak them every day in apple blossom oil. And then they would shift to frankincense and myrrh and all of these expensive things. And Chanel number 5. And Chanel number 6 and 7 and 8. They would do everything they could to make them beautiful and appealing. And so there was a young girl named Esther. Now I'm going to tell you, Esther had lost a lot. If anybody had a right to be nasty, angry, and grumpy, it was Esther. If anybody had a right to say, I've been cheated, I've been robbed, I've been treated dirty, I've been treated bad, it was Esther. Her people were pulled out of Israel and dragged halfway across the world to become slaves in a place they didn't like. I mean, do any of you know how Persian people today treat their women?
Yes.
What makes you think anything's changed? And so Esther was brought from Israel. She saw the temple destroyed. She saw the city burned and sacked. She had memories of all this, and her father and her mother were killed, and she was allowed to live. And she got there, and she was to live with an old uncle. If any of you want a clear explanation, ask Elijah what it's like to live with 2 old folks. He will give you a clear, precise picture of what it's like to... And she did it with no complaint. She loved Mordecai. She respected him. She grew, you know. He taught her all those things that a little girl learns between 7 and 14. He taught her all those things because he loved her. He cared very much. He followed the law of God. He followed the purpose of God. He was very, very religious. He had deep, deep values, and he conveyed those values to her, to Esther. And yet, if anybody had a right to be bitter, it was this woman. And then, after all that's said and done, riding into town, there comes these 4 horsemen. And those 4 horsemen weren't much different than the 4 horsemen we think about from Revelation. They came into town. They looked around. They said, you, and you come with us. Picked them up, took them off, carted them, and shipped them all the way to Shushan. See, a lot of times we get very upset with our lot in life. I want you to understand that I should have a very easy life. I should have all these good things. I should have all these blessings because I am me. Yeah, I love what Patrick taught me. Patrick said, I want you to understand I am the world's #1 expert on my own opinion. That's pretty good. I like that. That is true. That is true. That is the way that it is. And that's what I bring to the world. It's my own opinion. And she came to this point by accepting that it was somehow the will of God that she go through all that. Can you imagine how tough she was? Not on the outside, but on the inside. How strong, how virtuous. Can you imagine how virtue and honor were burned into her soul? What? The difficult problems that she had been through. God never gives you hard times because he doesn't like you. He gives you hard times because he does like you. And I don't care what they told you about yourself. They were wrong and he is right.
Amen.
God has potential and purpose for every person.
Yes.
What can he do?
Yes.
And so she went, and of course, being the kind, gentle, humble girl that she was, she wound up with the people who took care of these girls. I mean, I imagine a lot of these girls were real snouts. I mean, have you ever seen a teenage girl, 14, 15, who thinks she's the cheerleader, she's the song leader, she's the this, she's the that, I mean, she's just everything. And she just thinks she's really the hot snot. She really is. And suddenly along comes a girl who's just plain nice. Yes, sir. No, sir. May I please? Thank you. Talking in a civil way to these servants in an unclear, uncertain circumstance. See, the hardest thing to be a Christian, the hardest thing to be a Messianic, the hardest thing to be alive is to live in the midst of uncertainty as though you are walking on concrete.
Yes.
The hardest thing is to, in the midst of uncertainty everywhere, to say, God knows what I'm doing. God knows where I'm going. God knows what my purpose is. God knows what he wants to use me for. God wants, I can spend every day saying, God, what am I doing here? But he has a purpose. And she radiated that in a kind of contentment for life. I mean, can you imagine? Somebody that beautiful, somebody that talented. I believe she was very, very intellectual also. And I believe this is the first one. When she came to the king, he asked her a question, and she gave him an intelligent answer in 3 languages. And he suddenly knew this girl's different. And he could talk to her. I mean, the other ones were pretty, they were nice, they were good for this, they were good for that. They were good for nothing. But she had character. She had honor. There was intelligence behind every discussion that the two of them had. And eventually it came to be her turn. And she was dressed in an appropriate dress. They put on her the appropriate jewelry. They gave her the most appropriate smells, perfumes. Excuse me, I'm crude. They put on her absolutely the best. And sometimes less is more. Sometimes simplicity is the genius of what things should be. And she went to him. And she had the jewels, and she had the hair, and she had the gown, and she had the quiet confidence of the God of Israel. And so she went into him, and she talked to him and stuff. I will not describe the stuff. I will just describe the talk. But she hid her nationality. Mordecai said, keep your nationality to yourself. And I understand this. I've been to prison 42 times. And in prison, you don't tell anything. One of my geniuses for going to prison with Kairos Prison Ministry, I'm a hard guy to ignore for 4 days in a row. And in the end, they all wind up talking to me. And you discover when you're in prison that he'll say, Pastor, I've never told anybody this, but I'm a lawyer.
Yes.
Can you imagine he won't tell anybody in prison? Somebody else will say, Pastor, I don't tell anybody this, but my daughter is a cheerleader at Princeton. Can you imagine he doesn't want to tell a whole bunch of prisoners, inmates, sex fiends, perverts, whatever they are. He doesn't want to tell them about his daughter. Not that he's ashamed of it. The most precious things you have, you hide in your heart. The precious things you have, you hide in your heart. And so I know from going to prison all those times, they have a section set up. This is kind of neat, where you sign a piece of paper and say, I want to talk to the pastor or the pastors, because there's a pastor at every table. And depending on what the pastors say, these people decide if they want to talk to you or not. And so this one guy said, I want to talk to Pastor Brennan. And so they make time where he and I exit the group. We sit at tables with 8 people, 6 inmates and 2 people from the outside. And we sit there, same table for 4 days. You don't change tables because you want to meet the people. So if you change tables, you go through the same superficiality every day. So you get to one table and you stay there. So he says, I want to talk to Pastor Bresnan. And so they put us in this little room that's about half the size of that closet there. I mean, you're sitting knee to knee and, about 3 feet apart, and books piled up and all the junk and stuff. And I said, yes, what would you like to talk about? He says, nobody knows this, but he says, I am the head gypsy for the state of Florida. Every fortune teller pays money to me. Every thief pays money to me. Every graft and corruption pays money to me. He says, and here I found Christ, and I have to give it all up. I have to give it all up. What do I do? And then the music started to play. The angels came down.
Yes.
Lord, they go. No, and I did not give him an answer, because his answer was of God. God had to answer him, but I know why Mordecai said, don't tell. There are certain things you keep to yourself. You know them and you use them, and there will come a time when God will use them, but you don't tell them. You don't tell them. And so that's the way she was. She had this secret within her heart. And I believe she was very, very good, very easy to talk to. She was very, very literate. I believe she had a good understanding. And she was the one that the king chose. And I don't believe he chose her because of her bust size. I don't believe he chose her because she was the most glamorous or the most amorous. I believe he chose her because she was a woman of virtue. Mm. She was a woman with honor and character. And it came through, and her God radiated like the perfume that they put on her. And the king said, I want this. I want this. And the question that we deal with today, we're going to deal with other questions in the future. And the question I want to deal with today, how can God use a person of virtue, a person of honor? Because that is what God is asking of us in a generation that does not respect honor or virtue. Mm-hmm. They will do anything they can to get you all stirred up over your gender, over your race, over that you have the wrong 3 genders. They will do anything they can to get you stirred up over your education. It's either not good enough. I mean, I can't believe this. They were trying to tell me, Elijah was explaining to me about 5-6 years ago, that if somebody went to school and college and got good grades, they were too white.
Yeah.
What? I said, Elijah, come on. You don't believe that, do you? No. They will twist everything they can to destroy you, to destroy what is going on. They will twist everything to bad. So I understand when you go to prison, you don't tell them you got 2 doctor's degrees and 3 pastor's degrees. The first thing I say, what are you doing here? Mm-hmm. You know. So God is looking for people of honor and of virtue. Mm-hmm. And she winds up in the key position. And next week, we will take a look at Mordecai, and we'll take another look in a deeper way at her, because God will use you. Will you rise for the Aaronic benediction?